August 1st, 2007. Powder Springs, Georgia. After not being heard from for over 30 hours, 46-year-old Jane Kuria and her two daughters, 19-year-old Isabella and 16-year-old Annabelle, are found bludgeoned to death inside their home. Jane's 8-year-old son Jeremy and her 11-year-old nephew PK Thande are also severely beaten, and while they wind up surviving their injuries, they are unable to provide much information about who attacked them. Investigators explore a number of different scenarios, including some family friends who display suspicious behavior following the murders, but the crime is never solved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and on this episode, we're going to be exploring a case which was featured on the Unsolved Mysteries podcast, the 2007 murders of the Kuria family. Since The Trail Went Cold has been around for over 9 years now, I'm sure you've probably noticed that we've covered the vast majority of cold cases which were featured on the original Unsolved Mysteries TV show, as well as the Netflix reboot, but there are still plenty of cases to explore from the official Unsolved Mysteries podcast. This podcast officially launched in February of 2021, and while it came to an end 2 years later, it released over 90 episodes, and the majority of their featured cases are still unsolved and deserve further review. One of the earliest episodes they produced which made a big impression on me was the Kuria family murders, a case that has surprisingly not gotten a ton of media coverage, considering that it involved an entire family, including multiple child victims, being brutally attacked inside their home. Jane Kuria was a widowed single mother of 3 who relocated her family from their native Kenya to the United States and was attempting to seek asylum since she had been an outspoken opponent of female circumcision. Well, at the time this crime took place, Jane's 2 daughters, 19-year-old Isabella and 16-year-old Annabelle, and her 8-year-old son Jeremy, were staying at their home, and they were also being visited by Jane's 11-year-old nephew PK. But for reasons unknown, someone decided to enter their residence in the middle of the night and severely bludgeon all 5 victims, and while Jeremy and PK wound up surviving the attack, they had virtually no memory of what happened and could not provide much information about the perpetrator. Over the years, investigators have explored a number of different angles, including the possibility that the family was targeted because of Jane's activism from her time in Kenya. However, 2 of the most intriguing leads involve family friends of the Kurias, one of whom was a married man who seemed to have a close relationship with Jane, and the other of whom was a woman who immediately took steps to obtain guardianship of Jeremy following the murders. But even though the actions of both these individuals have aroused suspicion from law enforcement, neither of them have been formally named as suspects or persons of interest, and there is a surprising lack of physical evidence to link anyone to the crime. As a result, these murders have remained unsolved for nearly 2 decades now, so we're going to explore all the different potential scenarios about what happened on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 80 exclusive bonus episodes and archives which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the Kuria family murders. Our story begins in 2007 in Powder Springs, Georgia, a suburb located in Cobb County about 20 miles northwest of Atlanta, which had a population of around 13,000 at that time. One of our victims is a 46-year-old widowed single mother named Jane Kuria, who has two daughters, 19-year-old Isabella and 16-year-old Annabelle, and an 8-year-old son named Jeremy. The Kurias originally hail from Kenya, but after Jane's husband died of pneumonia and the family's home was destroyed, they decided to leave the country in January of 2001. Jane and her husband were known for being outspoken opponents of female genital mutilation, also known as female circumcision. During her childhood, Jane was forced to undergo this procedure at the hands of an extremist religious sect, but she did not want her daughters to experience the same thing. Jane feared that her family was being targeted as retribution for her views, but the Catholic Church helped the Kurias flee Kenya and escape to South Africa before they sought asylum in the United States. When they first arrived in the country, they settled in Boston, Massachusetts, but in February of 2002, the Kurias relocated to Georgia. For the next few years, the family lived in an apartment while Jane worked multiple jobs to save up enough money for them to purchase a house. In 2005, the Kurias moved into a 2-story, split-level home located on a cul-de-sac in the Country Cove subdivision in Powder Springs. At this particular point, Jane is a licensed practical nurse and works as a nurse assistant at the Wellstar Paulding Medical Center in Hiram. She is known for being a strict but very loving mother who has raised good kids, and the entire family are regarded as being active, well-respected members of the community. Isabella was a straight-A student in high school who was hoping to become a pharmacist, so she has just completed her freshman year at Chattanooga College in Tennessee and is currently spending the summer vacation with the rest of her family in Powder Springs. Unfortunately, after years of legal wrangling, Jane's request for asylum was denied by a judge who felt that she provided inconsistent testimony. She retained the services of an Atlanta-based immigration attorney named Charles Cuck, who told the press, quote, "The judge did not believe she was subjectively afraid to go back to Kenya, one of the requirements of proving asylum," end quote. In spite of this, Cuck appealed the ruling, so new hearings were scheduled for August the 31st. In the meantime, the Kurias would be visited at their residence by Jane's 11-year-old nephew, Peter Thande, who went by the name PK. PK was the son of Jane's sister-in-law, Pauline Thande, and on July the 30th, he was dropped off at the Kuria residence and would spend the day playing with Jeremy and the rest of the family before he spent the night there. The following day, Pauline made numerous attempts to call Jane in order to make arrangements to pick up PK, but there was no answer. At one point, Pauline's older son, Owen Thande, stopped by the Kuria residence to check on them, but there was no answer at the front door. Owen said that even though Jane and Isabella's cars were still parked in the driveway, he did not see anything unusual at the house, so he just figured that someone may have picked up the entire family and taken them out to dinner, which is why Owen was not overly concerned. However, by the morning of August the 1st, Pauline still could not reach Jane on the phone, so she became panicked and convinced her niece, Diana Mina, to drive her to the Kuria residence. They arrived shortly before 10 a.m. and noticed that Jane and Isabella's cars were still parked in the driveway, so Diana decided to check around the back of the house. She noticed that the sliding rear door to the kitchen was unlocked and ajar, so Diana decided to go inside. Since the blinds were drawn, the house was dark, and the only illumination was from the TV set, which was still on and playing a cartoon. However, it wasn't long before Diana noticed a large amount of blood on the kitchen floor surrounded by a body, and while she suspected it was Jane, the victim's face had severe swelling, so she couldn't tell for certain. By this point, Pauline had appeared at the rear door, but Diana told her not to come in, and she used her cell phone to call 911. It wasn't long before police arrived at the residence and sealed it off as a crime scene. It turned out that the body in the kitchen did belong to Jane, as she had been bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. When police searched the house, they discovered that a massacre had taken place, as the entire family suffered the same fate as Jane. Isabella was found lying in a pool of blood on the hardwood landing next to the front door, and had likely been attacked at the top of the stairs. Annabelle was found in the upstairs hallway, as she appeared to have been fatally bludgeoned right after stepping out of her bedroom. Jeremy and PK were both found inside Jeremy's bedroom and were presumably attacked while they were sleeping. But while they each had serious injuries to the head, they were both still alive and unconscious, so they were immediately transported to the Children's Healthcare of Atlanta at Scottish Rite Hospital. Unfortunately, Jane, Isabella, and Annabelle were all pronounced dead at the scene. According to investigators, the entire crime appeared to be overkill and personal in nature, and was likely committed by someone who felt pure rage towards the victims. Since there were no signs of forced entry and the rear kitchen door was unlocked, Jane may have willingly let the killer into the house, and the positioning of the table seemed to indicate that they sat down to have a conversation before Jane was attacked. Based on the blood spatter evidence, investigators felt that Jane had put up a fight against her assailant before she was killed, whereas the other 4 victims were taken by complete surprise and had no chance to react. While the perpetrator likely left Jeremy and PK for dead, the blows they received were not as severe as those inflicted on the female victims. In fact, they may have survived because they were lying on soft surfaces at the time, such as pillows and mattresses, which created some give, which softened the killer's blows a bit. For the next several days, Jeremy and PK both remained in a coma and were placed under heavy guard at the hospital. Thankfully, both boys eventually regained consciousness and were able to make a recovery, though they initially claimed to have no memory of the attack and were unable to provide any information about their assailant. According to Jeremy, all he remembered was going to bed on the evening of July the 30th and then waking up in the hospital sometime later. As you might recall, Owen Thande had paid a visit to the Kuria residence on July the 31st and no one answered the front door, so it seemed likely that the family had already been attacked by that point and were lying either dead or unconscious inside. According to phone records, Isabella had replied to an email on her cell phone shortly after midnight on the 31st, but a call to Jane's cell phone went unanswered at 3:30 a.m. This meant that the crime likely took place sometime during that 3.5-hour window, which was approximately 30 hours before the victims' bodies were discovered. Since it was the middle of the night, no other residents from the neighborhood recalled seeing or hearing anything unusual during the time period of the murders. The murder weapon was never recovered, though investigators estimated that it was a long, skinny object which was approximately 12 to 15 inches long and pronged or forked at the end. And since nothing appeared to be missing from the residence, the killer likely brought the weapon with them. While there was a lot of blood at the 4 respective spots where each of the victims were attacked, there were surprisingly no traces of blood anywhere else, which meant that the perpetrator somehow managed to move between all these different locations without tracking any blood. For this reason, investigators cannot discount the possibility that multiple assailants were involved in the crime, and there were also no traces of blood outside the house on the driveway, sidewalk, or the grass. The authorities were left with virtually no physical evidence which could potentially link them to a suspect, such as DNA, fingerprints, or footprints. Even if the killer was injured when Jane fought back against them, their blood likely would have been mixed with Jane's blood at the scene, making it impossible to recover. However, a blood-stained hand towel would be found in a ditch located nearly 2 miles from the Kuria residence, and since it did not show up there until after the murders took place, it was believed to be connected to the crime. The towel was sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for analysis, and they managed to extract a DNA profile from the blood, which did not match any of the 5 victims. Well, on the evening of August the 1st, several hours after the bodies were discovered, Detective John Dawes, the lead investigator from the Cobb County Police Department, held a gathering outside the Kuria residence in which he spoke with around 30 friends or family members of the victims and said he would make himself available to them. Detective Dawes was soon approached by a man named Patrick, a family friend of the Kurias who often helped out and did chores at the residence, such as mowing their lawn. Patrick expressed his suspicions that the crime was committed by the Mungiki, a violent religious sect from Kenya who became known as the Kenyan Mafia and wound up being banned due to their history of criminal activity and ethnic violence. In fact, the Mungiki were known for demanding and enforcing female genital mutilation, a practice that Jane was outspoken about. According to Patrick, the Mungiki had been responsible for murdering Jane's husband and destroying the family's home, which prompted their decision to leave Kenya, and Jane had shared concerns that they might come after her. Well, Detective Dawes investigated this angle, but found no evidence to support it, as even though the Mungiki were undoubtedly responsible for a number of violent murders in Kenya, there was no documented history of them ever having traveled overseas to other countries such as the United States in order to commit crimes. However, the whole situation caused Dawes to develop suspicions about Patrick, particularly after he obtained a copy of the death certificate for Jane's husband and learned that he had actually died of pneumonia and that Patrick had lied about him being murdered by the Mungiki. Like the Kurias, Patrick originally hailed from Kenya and had been in the United States for a number of years. He was married and had 2 sons and attended the same church as the Kurias, and Annabelle sometimes babysat his children. But even though Patrick passed himself off as a casual friend of Jane's, a number of people told police that they seemed to have a much closer relationship than Patrick was letting on. According to Diana Mina, she had once seen Jane and Patrick together at a liquor store, as Patrick had parked his car and met Jane there so that she could drive him to a party. Even though this was never conclusively proven, Diana wondered if her aunt might have been carrying on a secret affair with Patrick. When Jane's phone records were checked, they showed that in the month prior to the murders, Jane and Patrick had called each other no less than 300 times and were doing so at an average of 10 to 12 times per day. Patrick's last phone conversation with Jane took place at 10 p.m. on July the 30th, but surprisingly, records showed that he did not make any attempt to call her on July the 31st or August the 1st before the family's bodies were found. Detective Dawes decided to bring in Patrick for a formal interview, but while he denied having an affair with Jane, his answer to most of the questions which were asked of him was simply, quote, "I don't know," as he had no explanation for why he never attempted to call Jane after July the 30th, even though they had previously been phoning each other about a dozen times per day. Since Patrick and his own wife had opposite work schedules, he usually worked during the day while she worked at night. Patrick claimed that he was home on the evening of July the 30th and the early morning hours of July the 31st, but since his wife was at her place of employment many miles away during this time period, she could not confirm this, so Patrick did not have a verifiable alibi. Investigators also learned that about a year before the murders, Jane had given Patrick a personal loan of $5,000. He was supposedly going to send it to his father in Kenya in order to convert the money and use it to purchase wheat, but it did not appear that Patrick ever paid the loan back before Jane was killed. For his part, Patrick claimed that Jane never put any serious pressure on him to pay back the debt, so there were no serious issues over this. However, following the murders, a piece of paper was found on the dining room table at the Kuria residence, which featured a handwritten series of numbers, which all added up to the combined total of $5,000. Since this was the same amount as Jane's loan to Patrick, it struck investigators as too much of a coincidence. Police also heard unconfirmed speculation from some of Jane's family members that there may have been an inappropriate relationship between Patrick and Annabelle, who was only 16 years old at the time. Whenever Annabelle babysat Patrick's kids, he would sometimes stop by the Kuria residence and offer to take Annabelle out to dinner as a reward for what she did, but they would go out alone without Patrick's family. If Jane found out that something was going on between Patrick and her daughter and threatened to tell everyone about it, things could have escalated into murder. In total, Patrick was interviewed 4 times by police, who collected his fingerprints, DNA, and a hair sample, but they cannot be compared to anything, since there appeared to be virtually no forensic evidence from the murder scene which belonged to the killer. Now, Patrick's DNA did not match the DNA profile from the bloody hand towel found 2 miles from the murder scene, but since it could not be conclusively linked to the crime, and investigators did not discount the possibility that multiple people were involved, the lack of a DNA match did not clear Patrick. After Jane, Isabella, and Annabelle were laid to rest, their surviving relatives claimed that Patrick stopped communicating with them and he never asked about Jeremy's well-being. But there were other potential leads in the case which did not involve Patrick. A few days before the murders took place, Jane had a phone conversation with her sister-in-law Pauline, in which she mentioned that she would soon be receiving $30,000 and would give it to Pauline's husband. When Pauline asked where this money came from, Jane answered, quote, "Oh, don't worry, it's just the business I'm getting into," end quote. It turned out that Jane had gone into the real estate business with some of her friends and they were planning to sell a house, but she never told any of her family members about this venture before her death, and neither Pauline nor her husband received any of the money that Jane promised. Regardless, While some of Jane's relatives wondered if her business dealings may have played a role in the murders, no evidence could be found to support this theory. After the crime occurred, the victims' loved ones held a fundraiser and generated over $50,000 to support Jeremy and cover the costs of transporting the bodies of Jane, Isabella, and Annabelle back to Kenya for burial. While all this was going on, a woman named Elizabeth, who had been friends with Jane and attended the same church as the Kuria family, seemed to take on the role of their unofficial, self-appointed spokesperson and spent a lot of time handling their affairs. For instance, Diana claimed that when she was asked to identify the victims' bodies, Elizabeth suddenly stepped in and told her not to worry about it because she would take care of everything. When Jeremy's paternal grandmother arrived from Kenya in order to visit him in the hospital, she was shocked to learn that she was no longer allowed to see him, as Elizabeth had removed her name from the list of visitors without getting the family's consent, and Elizabeth was also now listed as Jeremy's guardian. It turned out that Elizabeth had been spending a lot of time ingratiating herself with Jeremy's maternal grandmother, aka Jane's mother, and managed to convince her that gaining custody of Jeremy and handling the family's finances would be the best thing for everyone. Elizabeth also went so far as to sell Jane's house, car, and all of her possessions, and after Jeremy recovered and was released from the hospital, he went to live with Elizabeth and his maternal grandmother, so the paternal side of his family no longer got the chance to see him. Even though Elizabeth's actions aroused suspicion, no evidence could be found to suggest that she was involved in the murders. The only link between Elizabeth and Patrick was that they both happened to attend the same church, and neither of them have officially been named as a suspect or person of interest. In January of 2018, 11 Alive News in Atlanta produced a new segment about this case as part of their Gone Cold series. They mentioned that Jeremy had since moved back to Kenya with his maternal grandmother and was studying to become a doctor, while the other survivor of the crime, PK Thande, was a straight-A student studying music at the University of Nairobi. However, the most interesting new revelation was that PK now seemed to remember something from the night of the murders. PK had been eating an African dish called ugali when he suddenly turned to his mother and said ugali was the last meal he had eaten before he was violently attacked. This somehow triggered PK to experience a flashback where he said he had an image of being attacked by a man who was wearing what he described as an African floral print shirt. PK also said that this man spoke Swahili, one of the two official languages of Kenya, but he was unable to recall any details about his face. Shortly after this news segment aired, it was publicly revealed that Jeremy had recently had a tumor removed from his brain, so the Kenyan community of Atlanta was now fundraising to help cover his medical costs. They were hoping to raise $50,000 for Jeremy to return to the U.S. and undergo a procedure at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta at Scottish Rite Hospital to ensure that his tumor would not return or grow anymore. I'm not sure if Jeremy got to experience this treatment, but the good news is that in May of 2023, he appeared on an episode of the Investigation Discovery True Crime series Still a Mystery. The episode in question was titled Secrets of the DNA and featured a segment about this case where Jeremy, who was now 23 years old, was interviewed on camera for the first time. Jeremy continued to maintain that he had no memory of the attack, but spoke about what loving people his mother and his two sisters were. He also said that when he was raised by Elizabeth, she acted as a strict, controlling disciplinarian towards him rather than a loving mother figure, and she would never tell him when he could get access to his family's money, which were being held in some trust accounts. But the good news is that overall, Jeremy seemed to be doing quite well and had started a family of his own. Unfortunately, he still has no answers about what happened to his mother and sisters as the murders of Jane, Isabella, and Annabelle Kuria continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. Sadly, this is far from the only unsolved cold case I've ever featured on this podcast involving the murder or attempted murder of an entire family, and I always wonder what would drive someone to commit a heinous act like this. Even if the perpetrator had a personal grudge against one or more of the adult members of the victimized family, It's just shocking to me that they would take things to such an extreme and murder innocent children. When I first heard the episode about this case on the Unsolved Mysteries podcast, I remember it starting off with this chilling quote from the former lead detective, John Dawes. Quote, "What concerns me about this killer is the ability to inflict those assaults on a woman and two precious girls and those two little boys and not speak a word about it. That's completely narcissistic and sociopathic. That's what concerns me." End quote. As we're going to talk about momentarily, one of the potential suspects in this case is the family friend known only as Patrick, who had two children of his own at that time. I'm not necessarily saying that Patrick is the guilty party, but if he was, how could he manage to violently attack other children and then just go on to resume a seemingly normal life as a family man and remain silent for the next 2 decades? Of course, when the Unsolved Mysteries podcast episode originally dropped in April of 2021, they focused heavily on all the suspicious things involving Patrick and his relationship with Jane Kuria, but they never made mention of the angle involving the other family friend, known only as Elizabeth, and her shady attempts to gain custody of the surviving child, Jeremy. I never heard about Elizabeth until the aforementioned Still a Mystery episode aired in 2023, but it left me more unsure of what to think about this case. Of course, the big hole in the theory of Elizabeth being the killer is that if she wanted to gain custody of Jeremy, why would she have bludgeoned him in the first place? After all, he remained in a coma for several weeks, and it's clear that whoever attacked Jeremy and his cousin PK left them for dead, and it's only through pure luck that they wound up surviving. But even if Elizabeth was not directly responsible for the murders, some of the victims' relatives still believe that she might know more than she's letting on. What sets this case apart from many of the other family annihilation murders we've covered is that we do have 2 surviving victims, but it seems like they were both attacked while they were sleeping, and at least initially, they had no memory of the incident and cannot provide any information about who did it. Unfortunately, even though you'd assume that a crime where 5 people were violently bludgeoned might give you tons of evidence to work with, that just does not appear to be the case here, which is why this whole thing is still unsolved. Now, surprisingly, the Unsolved Mysteries and Still a Mystery episodes do not go into any detail about the reasons why the Kuria family left Kenya in order to start a new life in the United States. While they reference Jane's husband dying, they don't make mention of her being an outspoken opponent of female genital mutilation and drawing such a controversial backlash that it apparently led to the family's home being destroyed. They also failed to note that the Kurias' request for asylum had been rejected and they were appealing the decision, but there was a possibility that the family could have eventually been deported back to Kenya, even though Jane believed that their lives would be in danger if they returned. The details of the Kurias' life in Kenya have always been pretty vague, but even so, they had been residing in the US for 6.5 years at the time the murders took place, so no matter how outspoken Jane might have been, I have my doubts it would have been serious enough for someone to feel compelled to travel over 8,000 miles to a different continent in order to commit this crime. While Jane may have been some sort of outspoken activist in Kenya, that certainly did not appear to be the case during her time in Powder Springs, as her top priority was working as hard as she could to raise her 3 children as a single mother, and by all accounts, she was doing a tremendous job. I know that Patrick told investigators that he felt the family may have been targeted by the Mungiki, who are undoubtedly a very violent and dangerous organization, but are also not known for traveling overseas to perform murders on American soil. So overall, I really don't think the murders of the Kurias had anything to do with their lives in Kenya, and it's probably nothing more than a coincidence that the crime took place only 1 month before they were scheduled to appear at a hearing to appeal the rejection of their asylum request. Besides, if there was a chance that the family was going to be deported, why not wait for them to return to Kenya rather than travel all the way to the US to kill them? So while I think the Mungiki are nothing more than a red herring, it's still a pretty important red herring, since Patrick may have only mentioned them as part of an intentional attempt to mislead the investigation. While it certainly wasn't unreasonable for Patrick to bring this theory to the police's attention, what's troubling is that he flat out lied by telling them that Jane's husband was murdered by the Mungiki when he actually died of pneumonia. Why would Patrick do this, unless he was hoping to deflect potential suspicion away from himself? So looking at the timeline, it seems apparent that the crime likely took place sometime between midnight and 3:30 a.m. on July the 31st, approximately 30 hours before the victims' bodies were discovered. We know that Isabella was last confirmed to be alive when she answered an email on her cell phone shortly after midnight, but Jane did not answer a call to her cell phone at 3:30, though I'd be curious to know who was attempting to phone her at that time of night. Regardless, I'm sure Jane was killed before daylight hit, as PK had been spending the night, and Jane was supposed to arrange to return the boy to his mother, but she did not answer the door or any of the family's phone calls until the bodies were discovered on the morning of August the 1st. It might seem like too much of a coincidence that the crime just happened to take place right after PK arrived in the US from Kenya and elected to spend the night with his aunt and cousins, but I see nothing to indicate that PK was specifically targeted, and I think he was just likely in the wrong place at the wrong time. According to Jeremy, both he and PK spent most of the day playing outside and became pretty exhausted, so they went to bed pretty early, and it's possible that the perpetrator had no idea that PK would be spending the night in Jeremy's room. So it seems apparent that Jane was attacked in the kitchen sometime after midnight, and it's likely that all or most of her kids had gone to bed. I doubt that Jane herself had gone to bed, as she was probably still awake when the killer arrived, as the TV set was still on when Diana discovered her body, though I'd be curious to know if Jane had turned the TV on herself, or if the killer might have done so in order to cover up some of the noise they were planning to make. I'm not entirely sure if Isabella was sleeping before she was killed, but we do know that she was likely first attacked at the top of the stairs and bludgeoned on the hardwood landing next to the front door, so if she was awakened by the sound of her mother being killed, she might have been in the midst of heading downstairs before she was attacked. It does seem certain that Annabelle was awoken by some sort of noise, since she was found in the hallway next to her bedroom, and both girls likely had no idea what hit them and never got the opportunity to react. What's particularly disturbing to me is that it does not appear that Jeremy and PK were awakened by the noise, as they were attacked in their beds while they were sleeping. If the killer had immediately fled the residence after killing Annabelle, the two boys may have stayed asleep until morning and not been able to function as witnesses or identify the attacker. However, this person made a calculated decision to go into Jeremy's room and bludgeon the two boys in their beds, and it sounds like it was only by pure luck that they managed to survive. This indicates to me that even if Jane was the intended target, the killer was overcome with such rage that they felt the need to murder everyone inside the house. Like I mentioned earlier, the biggest hole in the theory that Elizabeth was the killer is that there was no logical reason for her to attack Jeremy. If she really wanted guardianship of the boy, all she had to do was flee the scene and let Jeremy stay sleeping in his room. However, since there was no sign of forced entry and the rear kitchen door was unlocked, it definitely seems like Jane may have known her killer and willingly let them inside the house. Of course, this scenario would certainly apply if either Patrick or Elizabeth was the killer, since Jane was friends with both of them, though there would probably have to be an important reason for her to invite them inside after midnight. Now, this logic would definitely make sense with Patrick, because if Jane was having a secret affair with him, I could see her having a private conversation in the kitchen at that time of night while her children were upstairs sleeping. As a disclaimer, it's never been conclusively proven if they were having an affair, but phoning each other 10 to 12 times per day and having over 300 calls over the course of 1 month does suggest a pretty close relationship. Since Patrick and his own wife had opposing schedules, where he worked during the day and she worked at night, it wouldn't have been too difficult for him to carry on an affair with Jane behind his wife's back. It was established that Patrick's wife was at work during the time period the murders are believed to have taken place, so I don't find it too unbelievable that he might have decided to pay Jane a visit at that time of night. We know that Patrick's alibi was that he was at home all night, but while it's never been confirmed if Patrick's 2 sons were there with him, it's possible they were asleep the entire time and could not verify his whereabouts. So for all we know, Patrick could have slipped out to do something and returned before his kids woke up, and they never even realized it. It's been established that the last phone call between Jane and Patrick took place at 10 p.m. on July the 30th, only a few hours before the murders presumably took place, but he never made any attempt to phone her at all on the 31st or August the 1st before the bodies were discovered. I ordinarily wouldn't hold that against anyone, but when you go from 10 to 12 calls per day to 0 at the exact same time the victim is murdered, that seems like quite a convenient coincidence. The situation brings to mind all those missing persons cases where a victim is trapped in a relationship with a controlling, abusive person who constantly phones or texts them and obsessively checks their whereabouts. Yet when the victim goes missing, the controlling spouse suddenly stops calling and texting them and becomes uncharacteristically blasé about the fact that they don't know where their partner is. It's almost like they start acting that way because they know exactly what happened to their spouse. Well, you could apply the same logic to Patrick as well, as the reason he suddenly stopped calling Jane because he just knew she wasn't going to answer. If Patrick was the killer, I'd sure love to know more information about the contents of his final 10 p.m. phone call with Jane, and if something might have been said during their conversation which drove him to murder. Obviously, if Jane felt threatened by Patrick, she wouldn't have willingly allowed him into the house that late at night, but on the other hand, since the murder weapon was never found, and there didn't appear to be any objects missing from the Kuria residence, it's been speculated that the killer brought the weapon with him. Since it was estimated to be between 12 to 15 inches long and had a parched or forked end, wouldn't Jane have gotten suspicious if Patrick or anyone else showed up carrying an object like that? Whatever the case, if the killer went to the trouble of bringing the murder weapon with him, that does point to premeditation rather than some argument gone horribly wrong, which escalated into violence. It's been reported that due to the placement of the table in the kitchen, Jane may have had a conversation with her killer before she was killed, and likely fought back against them. One theory which has been pushed forward is that if Jane and Patrick were having an affair, and she told him she wanted to end it, Patrick could have become angry and killed her, but would he really have become so enraged that he decided to wipe out her entire family? There's also the fact that Jane had given Patrick a loan for $5,000, which he had still not paid back at the time of her death. While Patrick claimed that she was not pressuring him for it, there was a handwritten series of numbers found on the dining room table which added up to the sum of $5,000. This once again seems like a convenient coincidence and a case that appears to be filled with them, and you could assume that Jane had been calculating the value of the loan and was planning to confront Patrick into paying it back when he arrived. When Jane's niece Diana was interviewed on the Unsolved Mysteries podcast, she seemed to think that the crime was related to a business dealing gone wrong and perhaps had something to do with Jane's decision to get involved in real estate, a venture she never told her family about. We know that shortly before she was killed, Jane had told her sister-in-law Pauline that she would soon be receiving $30,000, but never explained where it was coming from. I guess it's possible that Jane could have knowingly or unknowingly gotten herself involved in something shady, which led to her and her family being murdered. Or alternatively, something in Jane's business dealings fell through, which caused some financial problems, so she became more desperate for Patrick to repay his $5,000 loan, and she aggressively demanded it from him. However, while people have been killed for a lot less, it still seems pretty extreme for Patrick to not only murder Jane over $5,000, but kill all of her children as well. I guess I could see Patrick feeling the need to kill Isabella and Annabelle if they were woken up by the noise and saw him, but once again, what would drive him to walk into Jeremy's room and bludgeon him and PK while they were sleeping? While the following theory is based on nothing more than speculation and has never been conclusively proven, I do find it interesting that some people felt that Patrick may have had something inappropriate going on with Annabelle, who was 16. If this was true, and Jane found out and confronted Patrick about it, then I definitely think this is one issue that could have been serious enough to escalate into such a violent murder, as Patrick was a married man with children of his own, whom I'm sure would have wanted to protect his reputation. This would also explain why Patrick felt the need to murder Annabelle. If the noise woke up Isabella, then Patrick likely crossed paths with her and killed her as he was heading upstairs, and then ambushed Annabelle in the hallway as she was leaving her bedroom. Even if Jeremy was still sleeping at the time, Patrick could have been paranoid that Annabelle once told her brother something about what he did to her, which is why he felt the need to enter the boy's room and bludgeon him too to prevent him from talking. And of course, since PK just happened to be sleeping in there as well, he became collateral damage. Years later, PK said that he suddenly had a flashback to the night of the murder, where he saw a man wearing an African floral print shirt who spoke Swahili, though he did not get a good look at his face. Well, Patrick originally hailed from Kenya and likely spoke Swahili, and since PK did not live in the US and was just visiting, it's possible that he did not know Patrick and wouldn't have recognized him even if he got a good look at his face. Now, this flashback did not pop into PK's head until years after the fact, so we have no idea if it's a legitimate memory, and I'm not sure he would make a credible witness if a suspect was ever charged with the crime and PK was called upon to provide testimony. But if PK is remembering things correctly, that points to the perpetrator being a man, and is another piece of evidence which goes against the idea of Elizabeth being responsible. While we're on the subject of Elizabeth, the Unsolved Mysteries podcast is very vague when going into the details of Jane's real estate venture, as Diana simply said that Jane and some of her friends were planning to sell a house. But now I'm wondering if Elizabeth could have been one of those friends, which is why she seemed to develop a sudden interest in Jane's finances following her death. Once again, if Elizabeth was involved in this crime, and her motive was attaining guardianship of Jeremy, it makes no sense for her to bludgeon him, but it's possible that her real motive was to get her hands on Jane's money, and she did not intend on Jeremy surviving the attack. But since he made a full recovery, he automatically became the sole beneficiary of Jane's estate, which is why Elizabeth wasted no time at swooping in and convincing Jane's mother to make her Jeremy's legal guardian. As a result, Elizabeth got access to the family's trust accounts, and during the last interview he did in 2023, Jeremy confirmed that Elizabeth has still never allowed him to touch it. However, I think the more likely possibility is that Elizabeth had nothing to do with the murders, but was just a greedy opportunist who decided to capitalize on the whole situation. After all, Jeremy said that Elizabeth was not exactly a loving mother figure when she raised him, even though he had endured an unimaginable tragedy, so I think it's safe to say that she did not fight for Jeremy's guardianship because she cared about him. Since Elizabeth and Patrick's last names have never been released publicly, I've been unable to look up anything else about their backgrounds to determine if they seem like the type of people who would be capable of a heinous crime like this. Other than the fact that they attended the same church, investigators have been unable to turn up any connection between Elizabeth and Patrick, so I have no idea if they even knew each other. The only reason I bring this up is due to the possibility that multiple people were involved in the murders. I personally lean towards there being only one perpetrator, but I know that investigators have always been bothered by the fact that no blood was tracked throughout the house, even though the victims were attacked in 4 different locations. But I'm not sure why Jane would let multiple people into her house in the middle of the night, so I still think it seems more likely that this was a personal crime committed by someone that Jane personally knew. While there wasn't much physical evidence in the house to link the crime to a suspect, the one thing which could potentially lead to a resolution in this case was the discovery of the blood-stained hand towel in a ditch only 2 miles from the Kuria residence. The blood on the towel does not match any of the victims, but since it did not appear at that spot until the day after the murders took place, investigators seem to believe that the blood belonged to the killer. A DNA profile was constructed which did not match Patrick, but even if it had, I'm still not sure it would have been strong enough evidence to charge him with the murders. Technically, we still can't be 100% certain that the towel is connected to the crime, so even if he was guilty and the DNA matched him, Patrick could have just concocted a story about cutting himself in a completely unrelated incident and using the towel to wipe his blood before he tossed it into the ditch. But if the towel is connected to the crime, investigators don't discount the possibility that the blood belongs to an accomplice and Patrick was still involved, though I have no idea who he would have enlisted to help him with this. Well, a few years ago, it was announced that plans were underway to perform genetic genealogy on the DNA, and here's hoping that this will eventually link the blood to a suspect. Like I just mentioned, it's never been conclusively determined if this bloody towel was used by the person who committed the murders, but finding out who this blood belongs to could shed a lot of insight into figuring out if they were responsible for the crime. Even though this case did not get much national exposure until it was featured on the Unsolved Mysteries podcast, it really does seem like law enforcement went all out trying to solve the crime and have explored every possible angle. The original lead investigator, John Dawes, has since retired, but he still does interviews about the case and communicates with the victims' families, and he is clearly still haunted by the fact that he couldn't solve this and still hopes that he can witness a resolution. It sounds like Jeremy and PK are both doing pretty well today, and while Jeremy has experienced his fair share of hardship, it was nice to see him be interviewed on the Still a Mystery episode and reveal that he's now started a family of his own. However, it was heartbreaking to hear him say that he's sad about how his own children will never be able to know their grandmother or their aunts, as he's certain that Jane, Isabella, and Annabelle would have showered his children with love. So I definitely hope that Jeremy will eventually receive justice for his family. So if you happen to have any information about the Kuria family murders, please contact the Cobb County District Attorney's Office Cold Case Unit tip line at 770-528-3032. That's 770-528-3032. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released over 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about a triple homicide known as the Leathers Oil Company murders, which took place back in 1994, but even though 2 of the individuals involved in the crime were caught and convicted, the alleged mastermind, Tyrone Thies, has never been found and has remained a wanted fugitive for the past 3 decades. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 1930 disappearance of an abducted 2-year-old infant named Mary Agnes Maroney. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Tristan A. and DB Cooper. And no, that's not a joke. This person literally signed up for us on Patreon under the name DB Cooper. And if by small chance it happens to be the DB Cooper, then thanks for generously using some of the stolen ransom money to support us on Patreon. Also, I wanted to announce that The Trail Went Cold will be appearing on Podcast Row at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place in Boston, Massachusetts at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel, Boston North Shore, from July the 18th to the 20th. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code you can use to get 20% off. So please visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use the promo code ROBIN20 to get 20% off tickets. Once again, visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and the promo code is ROBIN20. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.